The red dirt road stretched long, flanked by fields of corn and golden wheat shimmering under the late afternoon sun. A small town lay peacefully in the heart of America, where life moved at a slow pace, like the lazy river drifting past weathered wooden houses. Clara lived on a farm a few miles outside town. She and her husband, Jacob, had what seemed to be a stable life. Every morning, she woke up early to prepare breakfast, tend to the vegetable garden behind the house, and help her husband manage the livestock. In the afternoons, she would go into town to shop or stop by the small cafe, where she could sit on an old wooden chair, gazing out the large window onto the quiet main street. Here everyone knew each other. They greeted one another when they met, chatted about the harvest, the weather, and the little happenings around town. But amid these simple conversations, Clara felt as if something had been left behind in her life, something she had never dared to name. Jacob was a steadfast man, born and raised on this land. He believed in hard work, responsibility, and order, the core values that had helped him keep his family's farm running for years. Every morning before the sun even rose, he was already outside checking on the livestock, inspecting the fences, making sure everything operated like a well-oiled machine. Clara loved Jacob, or at least she once did. They married young like most couples in town. It was a marriage without storms but also without the passion she had once dreamed of. Jacob was not a romantic man. He did not whisper sweet words, nor did he notice the little things Clara longed for. To him, love was fixing the porch when the winter winds made it creak, bringing in firewood before the cold set in. But to Clara it never felt like enough. Some nights she lay beside him, listening to the insects humming in the fields, feeling as if the distance between them was growing. This life was too quiet, safe yet empty, like an endless field stretching with no end in sight. She wasn't sure what she wanted, only that there was an unfulfilled longing inside her, waiting for something or someone to awaken it. Clara once dreamed of more. When she was younger, she loved painting and had thought about moving to a big city where she could pursue art. But like many girls in town, she chose love over dreams, married Jacob, and committed herself to farm life. In the early years she had no regrets. But as time passed, as her sketches were abandoned and her notebooks gathered dust, she began to feel like a part of her was slowly disappearing. She longed for someone to see her not as a wife, not as a woman who cooked dinners and did laundry, but as an individual with passion, with dreams. On long afternoons, as the sun sank behind the trees and the country wind blew through the windows, Clara would sit at the table, absent-mindedly tracing patterns onto the wooden surface. In her mind she envisioned another life, a person who could see her in a way Jacob never had. And then she would chastise herself for such thoughts. She had a stable life, a good husband, but why did her heart still yearn for something beyond her reach? That day the town held its annual fall fair. Not a grand event, but enough for everyone to gather, laugh, and enjoy small joys amid their routine lives. Clara stood by Mrs. Ruth's apple pie stall, chatting with some women from town, when a deep voice spoke from behind her. "Excuse me, may I have a slice of apple pie?" Clara turned around. Standing before her was a stranger, tall, with tousled dark brown hair and deep blue eyes like the autumn sky. He didn't seem to be from around here. His clothes were slightly dusty, his rolled-up sleeves revealing strong forearms, and he carried the look of a man who had traveled, seen things. Mrs. Ruth smiled, patting his hand. "You're new around here, aren't you? I don't think I've seen you in town before." "Yes," he nodded, extending his hand. "I'm Daniel. I came here for a while to fix up my grandfather's old house." Clara felt her heartbeat falter for just a second when Daniel's gaze met hers. It wasn't overly bold or intrusive, but something in the way he looked, like he truly saw her, unsettled her. "And you are?" "Clara," she replied, then quickly added, "Jacob's wife." Daniel smiled. "Nice to meet you, Clara." There was nothing particularly special about his smile, just a polite, ordinary gesture. But when Daniel turned away, Clara realized her hands had clenched into fists, as if trying to hold on to something fragile that had just slipped past. In the days following the fair, Clara ran into Daniel more often than she expected. Once, when she was at the post office mailing a letter, he was at the counter talking to old Mr. Thomas, the postmaster. Another time she spotted him outside the cafe, leaning against the wooden railing, sipping black coffee while gazing at the distant fields. They only exchanged brief words, a nod in greeting when passing each other, a polite inquiry about the day. But even that felt different. Daniel had a calm way of speaking, unhurried. He didn't ask prying questions, but whenever they talked, he truly listened. When Clara mentioned last year's storm that had knocked down part of their farm's fence, Daniel didn't just nod absent-mindedly. He asked if they would need any repairs before winter. Then one late afternoon, when Clara stopped by the town's small bookstore, she saw Daniel standing by a shelf, flipping through an old novel. "You like to read?" she asked softly. Daniel looked up and smiled. "I like a good story." That simple answer sent a small wave through Clara's heart. How long had it been since she had someone to talk to about the things she loved? Nothing had crossed a line. No lingering touches, no suggestive words. But every time she caught Daniel's eyes, something quiet slipped in, like a tiny flame flickering in the cold. And she knew she shouldn't feel this way. That night, the storm came without warning. Clara was preparing dinner when the wind howled through the cracks, and rain pounded against the roof like a frantic drumbeat. Jacob had been out all day helping a friend fix his stable, and would likely be home late. When thunder cracked through the sky, Clara heard a sharp knock at the door, a hurried sound lost amid the rain. She opened it and there stood Daniel. His shirt was soaked, raindrops trailing down his face, but he carried the same steady composure as always. "I'm sorry," he said, voice blending with the wind. "My truck broke down just outside. I think I need to take shelter for a bit." Clara hesitated for only a second before stepping aside. "Come in." Daniel stepped inside, bringing the rain's chill with him. As he took off his coat, Clara noticed the mud-streaked fabric on his sleeves, and a strange feeling rose inside her, a subtle tension, as if she had just crossed an invisible line. She handed him a dry towel, poured him a cup of hot tea. They sat across from each other in the small kitchen, the storm outside a wall separating them from the world. "How long have you lived here?" Daniel asked, breaking the silence. "All my life," Clara replied, staring at her hands. Daniel nodded, as if he understood what that meant. He turned his cup slowly in his hands, then said almost thoughtfully, "I once thought I'd stay in one place forever. But sometimes you have to leave to know what you truly want." Clara looked up, and for the first time, she let herself hold his gaze longer than necessary. In his eyes she saw something she had buried for years. A longing, a question she had never dared to voice. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside Clara, another storm had just begun. After that stormy night, everything should have gone back to normal. But it didn't. Clara started seeing Daniel everywhere. Not because he was intentionally seeking her out, but because she seemed to notice him unconsciously. One morning, as she stopped by the grocery store, she saw Daniel helping the store owner load sacks of wheat onto a truck. Under the soft morning sun, he wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand, flashing an easy smile at those around him. Clara stood at the store entrance, feeling her heart skip a beat for no reason at all. Another time, while leading her horse to the pasture behind the ranch, she saw Daniel driving past in his old pickup truck. He waved and she waved back, a simple gesture yet not so simple, because something between them had changed, and they both knew it. One afternoon, Clara went to the town library to borrow a few books. She was standing between the bookshelves, running her fingers over the spines of old leather-bound books, when she heard a deep voice beside her. "You like novels too?" She turned, startled. Daniel was standing there, holding a brown-covered book in his hand. I suppose so," she replied, unconsciously biting her lip. Daniel let out a soft chuckle. "Me too. But I prefer stories with a bit of adventure." Clara glanced at the book in his hand. A novel about people who dared to leave behind what was familiar in search of something new. A shiver ran through her, not because of his words, but because she understood exactly what he was implying. In that moment between the old bookshelves, as their eyes met, Clara knew she was going too far. But she didn't turn back. Clara started thinking about Daniel too much. During the day, as she hung laundry in the yard, she remembered his gaze in the library. While preparing dinner, she recalled the warmth in his voice. And at night, lying beside Jacob in the darkness of their familiar bedroom, she wondered, if it were Daniel instead, would everything feel different? She kept reminding herself that this was just a fleeting curiosity. But she knew she was lying. Because once the heart strays, there's no way back. Their next encounter was not accidental. Clara was at a small cafe in town, a place she sometimes visited in the afternoons for a moment of quiet. But this time she knew Daniel often came here too. And just as she had hoped, he walked in. Their eyes met for a brief second before Daniel approached her. "Do you mind if I sit here?" She should have said yes. She should have stood up and left. But instead she simply nodded. They sat across from each other, sharing a silence thick with unspoken words. Daniel didn't speak for a while, merely stirring his coffee slowly, as if contemplating something. Then his voice broke the stillness, low and deliberate. "Are you happy, Clara?" Her heart clenched. That question was more dangerous than anything else he could have said. She should have brushed it off with a safe answer. But instead she looked at him, and in her gaze there was no more pretense. Outside, the sun was sinking behind the golden fields. And inside Clara, all boundaries began to blur. Clara knew she shouldn't be here. That afternoon, instead of going home after shopping, she had driven out of town, following the dirt road that led to the old cabin Daniel was renovating. She wasn't sure why she came. Maybe because his question from the other day still echoed in her mind. Maybe because she wanted an explanation. Or maybe she just wanted to see him. Daniel stood on the porch as she stepped out of the car, his eyes locking onto hers in a long, unreadable moment. He didn't ask why she was there. He simply opened the door, as if they both already knew the answer. Clara stepped inside. The small house was bare, the scent of wood and fresh paint lingering in the air. She stood in the empty room, feeling her breath grow unsteady. Daniel remained near the door, his gaze heavy with unspoken conflict, torn between what he should do and what he wanted to do. And then finally he spoke. "Clara, if you stay here for even one more minute." He paused, his voice husky. "I won't be able to let you go." Clara swallowed hard. She could feel it. The fragile wall between them was nearly crumbling. She could turn around, walk out that door, and return to her life. But instead of leaving, she took a slow step toward him. Daniel didn't step back. And when the space between them disappeared, when his breath brushed against her skin, when his hands touched her face for the first time, gentle yet filled with all the emotions long suppressed, Clara knew that from this moment on there was no turning back. Clara returned home late that night. She stepped into the familiar kitchen, where the warm yellow light still cast a glow over the oak dining table. Everything was the same. The dish towel draped over the chair, the calendar on the wall marked with Jacob's hurried notes. Everything remained unchanged, except for her. Jacob was sitting in the living room, flipping through the newspaper as he did every evening. He looked up when he saw her walk in. "Where were you so late?" A simple question, yet it made her heart pound. She knew she had to come up with a reasonable explanation, but the memory of Daniel's hands on her skin, his breath whispering against her ear, was still too fresh, too vivid. I stopped by the library," she lied. Jacob nodded, not suspecting a thing. He simply reached out, pulled her close, and placed a kiss on her forehead, a familiar gesture of affection, but now it made her breath catch in her throat. Clara closed her eyes. What have I done? In the days that followed, she tried to act normal, but she was no longer the same person. Every time Jacob touched her, guilt sliced through her like a sharp blade. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw a different woman, a woman who had betrayed her marriage. But the worst part wasn't the guilt. It was the longing to see Daniel again. She knew she had to end this. But as she walked through the small streets of town, as her eyes unconsciously searched for Daniel among the strangers, she realized she wouldn't be able to escape so easily. And maybe some part of her didn't want to. Everything started to crack. Clara had always been a devoted wife, at least, that's how everyone in town saw her. But now she was unraveling. She became irritable, distant when Jacob spoke to her. She flinched whenever someone mentioned Daniel, even if it was just in passing. She felt like all eyes were on her, as if this small town was slowly suffocating her with the weight of her own secret. Jacob started to notice. "What's wrong, Clara?" he asked one evening when she absent-mindedly forgot about dinner, something she had never done before. "I'm just tired," she replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. But Jacob wasn't easily convinced. He watched her longer than usual, his eyes filled with quiet suspicion. A vague fear crept into Clara's heart. Did he suspect anything? Worse, someone else had noticed her too. Martha, the cafe owner's wife. Martha was the kind of woman who never missed a piece of gossip in town. And Clara realized that one morning when she walked into the cafe, deliberately choosing a secluded corner, only to catch Martha's eyes scanning her with a hint of curiosity and scrutiny. "You've been coming here a lot lately," Martha said, stirring her tea slowly. Clara forced a small smile. "Just wanted a change of scenery." Martha nodded, but her gaze lingered on Clara for a beat too long, as if she were piecing together a puzzle Clara didn't want anyone to solve. If Martha knew, who else did? A wave of anxiety tightened around Clara's chest. She felt like a hunted animal. One wrong move and everything would collapse. She had to stop. She had to stay away from Daniel. But when she turned toward the window and saw his familiar figure walking down the street, her heart betrayed her reason. She wasn't ready to let go. Clara knew she had to stop. But Daniel had become an addiction. One that burned slow and deep, no matter how hard she tried to suppress it. Their next meeting was no longer an accident. That night, Jacob came home late. He texted to say he was staying at a friend's farm to help fix a tractor, and might not be back until morning. Clara stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She should use this time to clear her mind, to rethink everything. But she didn't. She grabbed her keys, drove out of town, and only realized where she was going when the lights of Daniel's cabin appeared in the darkness. Daniel didn't ask why she was there. He stood at the door, looking at her with an expression that told her he had been waiting for this moment too. When he pulled her inside and shut the door behind them, when their breaths tangled in the dim light, Clara didn't think about Jacob. She didn't think about the consequences. She didn't think about the town full of watchful eyes. There was only Daniel. Only his warmth, his hands, the way he made her feel alive again. And in that moment, she let herself go without resistance. But they didn't know they weren't alone. When Clara left the cabin before dawn, Daniel's warmth still lingering on her skin, she felt it. A gaze watching her from the shadows. Someone had seen them. Her heart stuttered. Everything was about to fall apart. The next morning, Clara woke up with a gnawing sense of dread. She made coffee as usual, forcing herself to act normal. But when Jacob walked into the kitchen, looking at her with an unfamiliar expression, colder, slower, she knew something had changed. He didn't speak for a long time, just stood there watching her. "Is there something you want to tell me?" A simple question, yet it made all the blood in Clara's body freeze. She set her coffee cup down with a sharp clatter, her heart pounding wildly. "What do you mean?" Jacob didn't answer right away. He pulled his phone from his pocket, opened a photo, and placed it on the table between them. Clara looked down, and her world collapsed. It was her, standing at Daniel's door in the middle of the night. Undeniable. Unmistakable. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling. Who gave this to you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, nearly breaking. Jacob didn't respond, but his eyes held pain, anger, and a deep, quiet disappointment. Clara couldn't breathe. Someone had seen her. Someone had taken this photo, and someone had sent it to Jacob. It was over. The air in the kitchen grew heavy, suffocating. Jacob was still looking at her, waiting. There was no tenderness left in his gaze, only hurt and betrayal. "Do you want to explain?" His voice was low, but a storm was brewing beneath the surface. Clara wanted to lie, to say it was a misunderstanding, to find a way out. But how could she deny it when the truth was staring them both in the face? She clenched her hands together, trying to keep her voice steady. "Jacob, I'm sorry." He let out a bitter laugh. "Sorry," he echoed. "That's all." Clara lowered her head, feeling everything crumble around her. "What did I do wrong, Clara?" His voice cracked, raw with pain. "Was I not enough for you?" "It's not that," Clara nearly shouted. Then why? She didn't know. She truly didn't know. All she knew was that in the monotony of her days, Daniel had appeared like a storm, sweeping her away. And now that storm had destroyed everything she had ever known. Jacob slammed his fist on the table, making the coffee cup tip over. Clara flinched. She had never seen him like this. "The person who sent this photo said the whole town knows about you." Her heart sank. Not just Jacob. Not just Martha. Everyone. And in a small town like this, Secrets never stayed hidden forever. Do you love me? Jacob asked the question in a hollow voice. Clara opened her mouth, but she couldn't answer right away. And in that hesitation, everything ended. Jacob nodded, as if he finally understood. He stood up and walked away. Clara sat there alone. Broken. Jacob left the next day. He didn't yell. He didn't break things. He didn't beg or curse her. He simply packed his bags in silence, as if they both knew there was nothing left to salvage. Clara didn't stop him. She had no right to. The whispers in town grew louder. When she walked down the street, she could feel the stares, hear the hushed conversations behind her back. She had broken the unspoken rule of small towns. Affairs were never secrets for long. And Daniel? He wasn't spared either. A week later he came to her. "We can leave," he said, gripping her hand tightly. "I can take you away. We can start over somewhere else." Clara looked at him. She had wanted this once. But now, as she stood among the ruins of her own making, she realized she couldn't run. "No, Daniel," she whispered. "We were wrong from the start." He looked at her, hurt, disappointed. But they both knew it was the truth. Clara stayed. She didn't leave. She didn't hide. She faced the whispers, the stares, the weight of her choices. And Jacob? He never came back. As for Daniel, he left a month later. He took the storm with him and left Clara alone in the silence. She didn't know if she regretted it. She only knew that one autumn morning, when she stood in front of the mirror, she no longer recognized herself. Winter came. The small town gradually returned to its usual rhythm, but Clara knew she would never be part of that normalcy again. She was no longer Jacob's devoted wife. No longer the woman praised by the town's housewives for her perfect pies. Now she was Clara, the woman betrayed by her own choices. Martha still watched her with scrutinizing eyes every time she stepped into the cafe. Some people in town avoided her gaze. Some whispered and smirked behind her back. But worst of all, most no longer cared. This town could crush a person with its gossip, but it also grew bored quickly and moved on to the next story. Clara was no longer the scandal of the moment. She was just the remnants of an old disgrace, a cautionary tale whispered to young girls as a warning not to make the same mistake. There were nights when she couldn't sleep. She dreamed of Jacob, not the angry Jacob, but the Jacob from before, the man who had loved her with quiet patience and unwavering kindness. She also dreamed of Daniel. Not the Daniel of stolen nights, but the Daniel of a life they never got to live together. And when she woke, she realized neither of them belonged to her anymore. Only she remained. Eventually, everything settled. No one spoke Clara's name as if it were breaking news anymore. But the stain remained. She had once thought she couldn't continue living here. But the town hadn't pushed her out, and she hadn't left. She found ways to change. She no longer went to the cafe in the mornings, no longer lingered in town to chat with the other women at the market. Instead, she sought out things she had never paid attention to before. She took a job at a small farm on the outskirts of town. Just simple work, but it kept her busy, kept her from thinking too much. Her hands grew callous from holding tools, her skin tanned under the rural sun. But Clara didn't complain. Perhaps this was her way of atoning through work, through silence, through slowly becoming someone else. Occasionally, she saw Jacob in town, brief glimpses, only when he returned to handle some business. They never spoke. But once, as he passed her in the grocery store, he nodded at her. No anger. No bitterness. Just a quiet nod from a man who had once loved a woman. And Clara understood that this was all he had left to give her. She didn't know what the future held. But she knew she wasn't running anymore. She would stay, keep going, and accept that some mistakes couldn't be undone, only lived with. A year passed. The town moved on as it always did. Seasons changed, festivals came and went. New secrets replaced old ones. And Clara remained, but she was no longer who she had once been. One afternoon, as she stood in line at the grocery store, she overheard two women talking in front of her. "I heard old Scott's daughter Amelia ran away." "Yeah, fell for some stranger from the city. Can you believe it? Young girls can be so reckless." They giggled between themselves. Clara said nothing, only gazed out the window. She understood Amelia. She understood that desperate need to escape, to find something bigger, wilder. But she also understood that not everyone could outrun this place. And sometimes running wasn't truly an escape. That spring, Daniel returned to town. No one had warned her. No rumors had spread beforehand. She only knew when she saw him standing at her door. Same posture, same eyes, but something was different. They stared at each other in silence. Daniel opened his mouth as if to say something, but Clara lifted a hand, stopping him. "No, Daniel." She shook her head, her voice quiet but certain. She didn't need to hear it. Didn't need to ask why he had come back, whether he still loved her, whether they could start over. Because the answer was already there. She had changed. She was no longer the woman she had been. Daniel looked at her for a long time, then slowly nodded. Neither of them said another word. He turned and walked away, moving toward his car. She stood watching until he turned onto the winding road leading out of town, until his figure faded into the early spring breeze. And she knew this time he would not return. The sun began to set. Clara stood there alone, bathed in the fiery orange glow of dusk. She took a deep breath. She was no longer waiting for anyone, and for the first time in a long while she felt truly free.